Episode 48 of Segaiden is cool, like a passing breeze.
He didn't fall? Inconceivable. You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
We've arrived at one of the big ones, maybe the biggest one. And of all of Sega's arcade-to-home conversions to Master System, this is the one that they probably needed to get right.
We've arrived in October 1987, and that means the console race has truly begun to heat up in the US after several years of post-crash dormancy. Nintendo and their third parties have been melting American faces with one top-flight medium redefining release after another, while Sega has done its best to keep pace, despite lacking the licensee support that had become an essential element of the NES formula. By October, the NES had seen the majority of its major, desirable 87 titles, with the exception of some stragglers like Mega Man and Wizards and Warriors. Oh, and Jaws, of course, from the creators of Sega's Wonder Boy. These hits included The Legend of Zelda, which brought the depth and breadth of action RPGs for Japanese home PCs, think Dragon Slayer and Hydlide, to consoles, and introduced the idea of a cartridge that could save player progress. Metroid, Kid Icarus, Rygar, and the Goonies 2, early exploratory action games. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, which ran on a special ROM chip that could harness Space Harrier's background tile as interactive element mechanic so fluidly that it delivered a boxing experience every bit as technically impressive as Rocky, even if it opted for cartoon whimsy over cinematic realism. And that's just the tip of the NES iceberg. Nintendo and its partners truly delivered in 1987. Nevertheless, the Master System soldiered on in America despite this raw numeric disadvantage, making nearly every release count. If Sega couldn't beat Nintendo in terms of volume, they could nevertheless hold the line in terms of quality and technical innovation. And with Outrun, we have an example of both, though perhaps a bit less of the innovation was visible for players outside of Japan. Outrun gives Master System its fourth adaptation of a Super Scaler arcade release, and Sega absolutely nailed it with this one. As impressive as Hang-On looked at the Master System's launch, and as incredible as Space Harrier's hacked-together recreation of the Coin-Op's full-size 3D combat looked on a home console, Outrun nearly perfects the science of 8-bit Super Scaler demakes. No, it doesn't look as good as its Coin-Op inspiration, but it moves as it should, and it plays, well, pretty much spot on. And you know, if there was any game for Sega to get right on Master System, it was Outrun. Sure, they fumbled Enduro Racer by turning it into a clunky Paperboy Excitebike derivative and chopping out half of its content for the international release, but they could afford to do that with Enduro Racer, because who even cares about Enduro Racer? Outrun, though, Sega had to get that one right. Although it may not have been the first Super Scaler release, Outrun has gone down in history as perhaps the defining Sega game, the one that truly defines the company's love of marrying technical innovation to the sheer joy of play. When website UK Resistance launched its Blue Sky and Games campaign back in 2005 as a riposte to the games industry's growing obsession with dark, desaturated visuals, Outrun became a poster child for their commentary. It represents everything light and upbeat about gaming, high-speed thrills, grand vistas, and earworm music, all counterbalanced by a profound sense of casual cool. Racing games existed before Outrun. Heck, Super Scaler racing games existed before Outrun. But no game before Outrun had captured the true appeal of driving. What we had seen before were tense, competitive imitations of being in or on a high-speed vehicle trapped within the confines of a racecourse. And while Hang-On's ride-on model undeniably perfected that sensation, Outrun brought a different sensibility to the genre. This is a racer where you drive not for time, although of course you do that too because it's still an arcade game that wants to separate you from your pocket change, but because driving a fast, cool car along beautiful roads with, in this case, a cute girl is just a fun thing to do. This is a racing game where your virtual driver doesn't wear a helmet or racing gear. He and his passenger have put the top down on his car to let the breeze blow back their hair as they streak through scenic routes across an entire continent. You can't actually feel the coastal breeze as you play Outrun, but Yu Suzuki's team did their damnedest to capture that sensation. This involved a great deal of agonizing research by Suzuki, who told Retro Gamer magazine that he undertook a grueling regimen of driving across Europe's most gorgeous locations in a nice car for a few weeks, videotaping the scenery in order to recreate the experience. One can only assume that car fanatic Suzuki must have suffered the whole time doing a thing he loved on the company dime. On its most basic level, Outrun works similarly to the Sega racers we saw in SG-1000. The controller's buttons allow you to operate the accelerator and brake pedals, and the D-pad allows you to both steer and operate the gear shift to cycle between high and low gears. You earn points as you drive, especially when you pass other cars, which are positioned less as competitors and more as incidental road hazards. But points only really matter for bragging rights. The only metric that affects gameplay is time, which constantly ticks down as you tear down the highway. In arcades, Outrun ran on an upgraded variant of the original Super Scaler board, which didn't have a formal name and has come to be known simply as the Outrun board. With its additional RAM and CPU power, the Outrun board powered a more complex virtual driving experience. Please note that Suzuki does not like for fans to call this a racing game than Hang-On could. The roads in Outrun now rise and dip the way real highways do. Although these gradients don't affect your car's speed, the undulations of the course you drive add a thrilling element of unpredictability to the game by briefly obscuring the turns and collision hazards ahead of you. Now, granted, Enduro Racer also had variable road geometry, but it didn't feel as convincing as what you find in Outrun. The upgraded hardware allows Outrun's geography to move at a smoother, more convincing rate, whereas the Enduro Racer coin-op seemed comparatively choppy. Even more impressively, Outrun gives players the freedom to choose their destination. After all, this is meant to be a simulation of driving, not racing, don't get it twisted, and while you need to hit certain time targets along the way in order to be able to continue play because, after all, this is a commercial video game that runs on the fuel of capitalism, Outrun aims to capture the spirit of a road trip. It's the essence of an 80s driving fantasy. You steer a faux Ferrari Testarossa that mysteriously comes in a convertible variant, listening to digital city pop, all while impressing a cute blonde lady with your road handling skills. Again, this is not a white-knuckled racing game, but rather a high-speed pleasure cruise. And that means the point is the journey, rather than the destination. So you get to choose your destination as you go. The road branches at multiple junctures, and you'll enjoy completely different scenery depending on which fork you take. Generally speaking, the right fork of each branch leads to a more difficult route, while veering left will lead you to a series of gentler turns and less chaotic competition. In a format that Taito would soon adopt for the stage progression systems in its Darius and Puzzle Bobble games, the branches form an expanding network of pathways. The branching stage tree ultimately leads to 5 different destinations. Because you can reach each destination by traversing a variety of individual highway segments, Outrun has phenomenal replay value. As if the fact that it's a highly enjoyable game experience in and of itself weren't enough, it also offers more than a dozen different scenic routes depending on the branches you select. Suzuki has said that he took the idea for giving players the freedom to choose their own route from the hit 1981 Burt Reynolds movie, The Cannonball Run. I'm not sure how much of that necessarily comes through here. Certainly the two works' soundtracks have nothing in common.
You say when there are no words.
But as mid-80s games from Japan leaning on Hollywood for inspiration go, it's one of the better and less conspicuous examples. Outrun reinvented the racing genre with its immense variety, unbelievable visual finesse, and Suzuki's desire to turn his love for the simple act of driving a cool car into an experience worthy of recreation all on its own. Fundamentally, Outrun worked like Namco's pole position and its many derivatives in the sense that you drove a car down a stretch of road, attempting to reach designated markers within a fixed amount of time. But comparing this game to pole position is like saying that Doom is pretty much the same thing as FACEBALL 2000. Arcade hardware doesn't really break down into the convenient generation groupings of progressive console hardware platforms, but Outrun felt as much like a next generation as you could possibly imagine in 1986, even if you had played Hang-On or Space Harrier. Speaking of Hang-On, Outrun naturally shipped in multiple cabinet variants, including 2 different sit-down versions, one of which was a Tycon model, like Hang-On's ride-on cabinet, that incorporated hydraulics in the style of a department store kid's writing toy. But even if you ended up stuck playing the boring upright cabinet that they had at all my local pizza parlors and skate rinks, Outrun presented the gamers of 1986 with an absolutely mind-blowing experience. Of course, the humble Master System version can't even begin to capture the visceral thrill of the expanded Super Scaler-style arcade game, with its hundreds of scaling sprites, its steering wheel and pedal controls, its dazzling FM synthesis soundtrack, and its breezy sense of cool. But Sega sure as hell tried. And while the Master System release of Outrun has a pretty negative reputation among today's spoiled gamers who have easy access to the arcade version across half a dozen different modern platforms, in 1987, this was pretty awesome stuff. Although Sega couldn't recreate the coin-op's wheel and pedal setup on Master System, anyone with access to several Japan-only peripherals could bodge together a pretty decent imitation. Outrun supported both the Mark III paddle controller, which we'll explore in a future episode, as well as the SG-1000's SH-400 steering wheel controller. Still, the Master System version of Outrun wasn't without competition. Outrun made such a huge impression at arcades in 1986 that numerous imitators popped up immediately in its wake. The best of these, Squaresoft's Rad Racer, aka Highway Star, actually managed to beat Outrun to a home release in the US. Shipping for NES a few weeks before the Master System of Outrun showed up in stores. This was clearly a preemptive counter by Nintendo to head off its competition and beat Sega at its own game. Despite being developed and released by a third-party publisher in Japan, the American version of Rad Racer came out from Nintendo itself. The game remained in circulation for years, enjoying tons of promotion by the company in magazines, as a featured title in The Wizard, and as a competition selection on the Nintendo World Championships cartridge. And Rad Racer really did play well. Plus, it offered a 3D visual mode, which of course involved anamorphic glasses in America, since Nintendo of America didn't bother localizing the Famicom 3D system. But Rad Racer was no Outrun, as much as it clearly wanted to be Outrun. It offered a single linear course, less dynamic scenery, and, much as it pains me to say about a Nobuo Uematsu soundtrack, vastly inferior music. But hey, that's no crime. Most video game music is vastly inferior to Outrun's. As much as Outrun redefined the basic concept of what a racing game could be by transforming it into a multiple-choice driving game, the game's soundtrack redefined the entire concept of what video game music could be. The young art of video game music had just begun to emerge from its chrysalis in 1986. Hiroshi Miyauchi's Hang On soundtrack, a single extended track inflected with hard rock guitars by way of FM synthesis, had shaken up arcades the year before, and opened the floodgates to rich, complex compositions. 1986 saw the likes of Namco's Rolling Thunder, which channeled jazzy Henry Mancini spy tunes, and Yuzo Koshiro's progressive rock-inspired score for XANADU's Scenario 2. Works like that had supplanted ditties and single-channel reworkings of public domain tracks that had defined game music to this point, but none of them shook the medium quite like Outrun's melodies. Outrun only contained 4 musical tracks, but those tunes fit the game perfectly. Literally, the game gave us one of the medium's earliest examples of diegetic music, with the player given the option to select one of 3 tunes on the in-game radio. And those tracks, Magical Sound Shower, Passing Breeze, and Splash Wave, have rightly stood the test of time thanks to composer Hiro Miyauchi's brilliant compositions. The tracks have a crisp, loose quality about them, combining elements of calypso and city pop, then presenting them by way of top-class FM synth. Each track sounds rich and layered, with hints of real-world instrumentation like steel drums and electric bass, but at the same time it's unafraid to simply go with the pure sound of FM synth. Of course, given that the mid-80s was the peak era of pop radio synthesizers, it sounds perfectly of the times. What is not perfectly of the times are the compositions themselves. In an age where game soundtracks generally consisted of 15-second audio loops, maybe 30 if a composer really wanted to burn through ROM data storage, Outrun's tracks ramble for upwards of 5 or 6 minutes apiece. Although these melodies do repeat, they do so in a progressive, additive sense, with new elements and variants emerging as a track unfolds. Each track has a bridge or refrain as well, including the seemingly free-form steel drum breakdown in Magical Sound Shower. Of course, all of this music isn't really freeform. It had to be crafted in advance and programmed meticulously into the arcade ROM. But Hiro did a stunning job of creating tunes that sound for all the world like a jam band improvising around a riff, despite existing as rigid mathematical code. Honestly, the music in Outrun could support an episode all on its own, but suffice it to say that Hiro broke new ground in game music. He composed a technically inventive suite of themes that perfectly complement the sensation of streaking down the highway in a sports car with the top down. Again, the Master System couldn't hope to recreate this polyphonic majesty. On the plus side, it does at least include the music, which puts it one over on the Master System port of Hang On. And Hero's melodies come through unmistakably, if somewhat unimpressively. The Master System's PSG audio simply lacked the range and texture to create a convincing imitation of the arcade sound chip. I suppose that's why Sega launched an entirely new peripheral around the same time that Out Run debuted. Well, at least in Japan anyway.
And here we come to one of the biggest differences between the American Master System and the Japanese Mark III. In the US, we had support for the light phaser. In Japan, they didn't, but they did have the FM sound unit.
Seemingly in response to the fact that Sega had decided to become purveyors of the world's greatest arcade music, the company's home division launched a peripheral to bring the Mark III more in line with the capabilities of their coin-op titles, at least as far as sound was concerned. The FM sound unit operates as something of a technological pass-through. It plugs into the Mark III hardware through the ribbon connector on the console's front side, and it covers the console's built-in AV port, effectively replacing it with its own. While this alternate jack amounts to a bit of a visual downgrade for those who obsess over graphical output standards, the FM sound unit lacks the console's default support for RGB signals, which is why I had to have mine hacked for video capture. It greatly enhances the quality of sound being generated. As the name says, the FM sound unit provides the Mark III with a stunning 9 extra sound channels, more than twice the channels available to the base console, combining with the PSG sound to triple the potential soundscape. On top of that, the sound unit contains a Yamaha chip, a scaled-down version of the chip contained in Yamaha's professional keyboard synth, and of course, in the Out Run arcade cabinet. Admittedly, the chip in the sound unit doesn't sound anywhere near as impressive as its arcade counterpart, since its FM generation only supports 18 operators versus the CoinOps 32, despite outputting more channels of sound. Operators in FM synth are, in short, the actual waveforms that comprise the sound within a channel. FM synth derives its unique audio quality from the way programmers combine multiple operators to either enhance or modulate one another. The more operators a chip supports, the more complex and varied the sound it can generate becomes. The FM sound unit lacks the complexity to duplicate the convincing faux instruments heard in Out Run's soundtrack in arcades, so even with FM enhancements, the Mark III game's soundscape doesn't stack up to the coin-op tunes. But that's picking at nits. At the time of its debut on Mark III, Out Run sounded better than any other console game that had come before it. The Famicom Disk System had debuted the previous year and brought slightly enhanced sound capabilities to Nintendo's console, but the FM sound unit could generate twice as many sound channels at once as the Disk System enhanced Famicom. When used correctly, this peripheral resulted in some truly stunning arrangements of the standard PSG audio. The sonic boost sounded so good that Konami would borrow the tech for their MSX audio enhancement cartridge and eventually even stick a near-identical FM chip inside a Famicom cartridge with Lagrange point. Sega clearly liked it too. When they retooled the Mark III into the Japanese Master System, now with light phaser support, they built the FM sound unit right into the hardware. Sadly, Americans and Europeans would only ever have access to the PSG. Sega pulled a Nintendo here and decided not to release their audio add-on internationally for some bizarre reason. I blame Tonka. However, they also decided not to bother removing FM audio data from localized games, presumably because extracting that code would have required more reprogramming than it was worth. So, with a region adapter, you can plug an American or European cartridge into an FM-enhanced Japanese console and access that secret sound. Only 2 games, Phantasy Star and Ys, dropped their FM code for Western releases, presumably due to the storage requirements of the translated game text. All told, Sega released about 60 FM-enhanced games worldwide, and weirdly, nearly a third of them never shipped in Japan, meaning their upgraded tunes remained more or less accessible until the age of emulation and hardware mods. It's a curious little sidebar to Sega's 8-bit history, but a fitting one. Out Run just isn't quite the same without those lush tunes, and Sega knew it. These days, better versions of Out Run are actually more easily accessible than the Master System release. But at the time, this conversion was a real bragging point for anyone who owned the console, even if kids outside Japan were denied its full glory. The game's popularity in Europe, where they love racing and driving games, led Sega to create several 8-bit follow-ups, which they released exclusively in Europe and Brazil. Outrun 3D, supporting the Sega 3D glasses, Battle Outrun, and Outrun Europa. These are distinct enough entries in the series that they probably deserve a separate exploration. For the moment, let's just take a moment to appreciate the fact that Outrun symbolizes Sega's determination to go down swinging as the gap in install bases between NES and Master System accelerated to the point of insurmountability. The Master System may not have been able to market itself worth a damn, but by God, could it fake a mean Super Scaler experience.
Next time on Segaiden, we write some walls.